Sisters, brothers, what a show of solidarity, of unity and defiance. And if there was ever a need for working people to have that solidarity and unity and defiance, it is this time today. Because our enemies who we are up against, the bankers who plunged us all into economic calamity, the tax dodgers who hoard tax as public services are slashed and burned by austerity, the poverty-baying bosses, they are united. And as they are united, we too will be united, standing against them as well. And friends, that is why we stand in solidarity with workers, many of them here today, who went on strike last week. Our National Health Service workers. Friends, all of us were born into the NHS. It looks after us when we need it. It's there for us till the very day we die. The least we can do is to stand out in solidarity when its workers demand fair pay at a time like this. Now, my grandmother died a year and a half ago in Edinburgh, and I miss her very much. And she was looked after by NHS workers. NHS workers from Lithuania, from Poland, from Bangladesh. The very existence of the modern NHS is an act of defiance against every single politician who stirs up hatred against immigrants. And as well, let's stand. It's great to see PCS out here in force, who are again out fighting, not just for themselves, but for fighting for every single one of us here today. Now friends, the trade union movement is often smeared and attacked by the establishment. It's attacked or ignored or marginalised. So it's up to all of us to be that little bit prouder, that little bit more confident. We are the biggest democratic movement on this island. We're a movement that represents everyone from dinner ladies to care workers to teachers to nurses to supermarket workers, those who collect the rubbish in the morning, the pillars of every decent society. If anyone should be ashamed of their funding arrangements, it should be a Conservative Party bankrolled by banks and hedge funds and legal loan sharks. Now friends, some of you won't believe it, but I was here in Glasgow on May the 30th, 1990. You won't believe it because some of you think I'm about 12. But I was here. And I marched, I'm sure, with some of you here in this crowd that day as well. And that day and that movement, including those like my own parents who refused to pay a single penny of that poll tax, that showed those who believe protest and civil disobedience is futile, it showed they were wrong. Because when we marched and when people pledged civil disobedience, they not only got rid of the poll tax, they helped boot Margaret Thatcher out of number 10 as well. And that is why we march. That is why we march. And Scotland, well, Scotland is a beacon for so many ways. It is, of course, the country of Jimmy Reid and Jenny Lee, the Red Clyde, the Upper Clyde. It is a country full of struggle, of working people standing together against the powerful with courage, bravery and determination. Let's keep that bravery and courage and determination today. Yeah! Because look at this society. Look at it. The wealth of the top 1,000 people doubling during an economic crisis in the last 5 years. Whilst at the same time, in this country of such wealth and prosperity, People are unable to even afford to feed themselves, forced to go to food banks in order simply to live. Who would design such a society from scratch other than a sociopath? It is a society which is fundamentally bankrupt. And look at it. Look at what we have in Scotland. Scotland, this nation of prosperity. 222,000 children in poverty, robbed of security, robbed of dignity, robbed of a future. We can afford to splash out money on weapons of mass destruction that would wipe out the world several times over, but we can't afford to give our children a future. What a load of absolute disgraceful nonsense. At the same time, in Scotland, 180,000 families languishing on social housing waiting lists, deprived of that very basic aspiration, an affordable home for them and their families. 1 in 5 Scottish workers in poverty, where across Britain, over 1 million workers have been driven into poverty wages since the Clegg Cameron Loving in number 10 back in 2010, where most people in poverty are in work, earning their poverty day after day after day. And friends, that's why I have to say, when Ed Miliband called for the minimum wage to rise to £8 by 2020, that was not just derisory, it was an insult. Because what that will mean in 2020 are cleaners on buses at 4 a.m. in the morning going to luxury mansions to work for people who earn in a day what they earn in a year. No one should work for their poverty. Never, never, never. Yeah. And at the same time, and look at the insecurity for young people. A generation consigned to being worse off than their parents, the first time that's happened in over a century. 120,000 predominantly young workers in Scotland alone on 0-hour contracts. A return to the Victorian age when dockers marched to the yard and stuck their hands up, hoping to get work that day, often to go home disappointed. Well, now young people get text messages at 6 a.m. in the morning telling them if they'll get any hours that day. No paid pension rights, forget about that. No paid leave, sick leave, maternity leave, nothing. How can you build a life? How can you build security? Of course you can. But friends, just to hammer into focus how unjust this society is. Remember the banks who plunged us into economic disaster? Always worth, I think, remembering, given our establishment often makes us or tries to make us forget. Those banks were not bailed out by free market dogma. They were bailed out by the state. They became the most lavished benefit claimant in Britain. But with one difference, with one key difference, so few conditions attached to that support, paying more bonuses than every other EU country put together, with Osborne going off to take the European Union to court for having the temerity to limit those bonuses. Whether it be paying record salaries, not lending to small businesses. But look at the plight instead of unemployed people. What happens with state support for the ranks of the unemployed? Well, hundreds of thousands of people every single year have their benefits sanctioned. What that means, for those who don't know, I'm sure most do, is a punishment for not fulfilling the strict obligations in exchange for receiving support from the state. Now, I want to give you an example of one. It's a 60-year-old man in Manchester called Stephen Taylor. He was an army veteran, and he was raising money for the Royal Legion, selling poppies, including in a supermarket where he was trying to find work, the 60-year-old. He had his benefits stopped, sanctioned for 3 weeks, because the fact he was volunteering for the Royal Legion showed he wasn't looking hard enough to get work. Compare and contrast unlimited support from the state for those at the top who plunged us into this mess, while support is stripped away from those at the bottom. Socialism for the rich, capitalism, sink or swim, for those at the bottom instead. And then there's UKIP. And then there's UKIP, the anti-establishment force led by that rare breed of politician, a privately educated white man who works as a city broker. Well, I've heard it all. The anti-establishment party bankrolled by millionaire Tory boners. That anti-establishment force whose latest two MPs are privately educated Tories who worked in the city. And what do they offer? Oh, those rare policies, privatisation, slashing workers' rights, slashing taxes on the rich. But we have to remind people that it was not Nigerian nurses who plunged this country into economic disaster. It wasn't Lithuanian cleaners. It wasn't Polish food pickers. It was the bankers at the top who plunged us into this mess. And that's why, friends, let's go out there and give people hope. That instead of people earning their poverty, instead of subsidising poverty wages with taxpayers' money, every single worker a living wage, no ifs, no buts. That instead of leaving people languishing on council housing waiting lists, deprived of that basic security whilst we line the pockets of landlords, let councils build housing, creating jobs and giving people homes they can live in. And it's great to see so many environmentalists here today, because we need to fight for the renewable energy jobs of the future. Secure jobs, not zero-hour contract jobs, jobs that save the environment and give people jobs as well. That the banks we bailed out should be under our control. That utilities and services we all depend on should be back under the control of the people, not profiteers ripping all of us off. And that those at the top, those tax dodgers who are clawing back every penny they can get whilst they leech off the state they are completely dependent on, they must pay every single penny of tax that they owe. The end of tax avoidance forever and real tax justice for all. Now, friends, it's fair to say, none of the Westminster parties are offering that inspiring, what I think many of you believe, the alternatives you believe in that should inspire all of us. So it's up to us instead. It's up to all of you today to fight for a better sort of society. Scottish democracy now is the envy of the entire world. Because after decades almost of cynicism, no longer people voting, universal suffrage fought for at such great cost but unwinding by stealth as people gave up on politics. Well, that didn't happen in Scotland, did it? Working class people who'd given up long ago, young people who it was always said were written off as the X Factor generation who are only interested in reality TV shows. Well, this independence referendum disproved the lot of them. And if we could only bottle up the democracy and the enthusiasm you have shown across the world, we would have a very different world than we have today. But here's the plea. Promises were made to you. Promises that if those at the top can get away with, will be broken, every single one. And that's why we need unity. So what people south of the border need to do is to stand in solidarity with you and demand that the elite give every single power to the Scottish people that they pledged. And just to wrap up, this is what gives me hope. Those at the top, those who rule, they depend on making us believe that injustice is like the weather. You can complain about it raining, but there's nothing you can do about it. Well, that's bollocks. And the reason for that is shown by our history. And it is a history of Scottish or English or Welsh workers or working people across the world who fought against those with power. Whether it be the Tolpuddle martyrs deported to Australia in the 19th century for setting up a trade union until hundreds of thousands mobilised to get them back. Other trade unionists who fought for the rights and dignity of working people. The Chartists who fought for working men to have the vote. The suffragettes, demonised, reviled, dismissed as anarchists and terrorists, force-fed in prisons. Whether it be those who fought sexism and racism and homophobia, those who built the welfare state and the NHS, These things were not given to us. People didn't wake up at the top one day and go, oh, I think I'll give women the vote. People had to fight for them at great cost, at great sacrifice. We never win. We never win by asking politely. We never win by hoping for the goodwill and generosity of those above. We win by making them fear us. Those with power must fear the people over whom they rule. So friends, let's learn from our history. Let's learn from our traditions. Keep inspiring the rest of us and showing us how democracy is done. And if we stand together, we fight together, friends, we will win every single battle ahead of us. Thank you.
Thank you, Owen. Now, all